secret is I just smile and say, follow me. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Life's too short not to really live. I got a big heart, I can let you in. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world.
Hi there, and welcome back to Toxic Bliss, Surviving Narcissism with me, Awen Reese. In the last episode, I got to tell you all about the birth of my bestest little guy, Mac. Although the birth and recovery were very challenging, within about a month we were healthy and strong and life was good. June, July, and August passed without any major incidents. Mike and I were still talking on the phone almost daily, but I had been pushing back on the idea of him coming to Connecticut. I know I had said yes to him when he called while I was in the hospital, but after going through that traumatic experience without him, it just made me angry. He should have been there. He should have been supporting me and helping me, but he wasn't, and I had still lived through it, more or less. I clearly didn't actually need him as much as I thought I did. I had learned something valuable. I had survived the worst experience of my life. I had almost lost Mac. I'd almost lost myself. And yet here we were, healed and perfectly fine, and I did it without Mike by my side. And probably even got through it better for him not being there than if he had been anyway. This realization changed my mind about a lot of things, and I was very blunt with him about it. One of the first calls we had after I had been discharged was him wondering when I wanted him to come back up. And I said not now, because I was dealing with the post-infection recovery and I needed peace and quiet to heal. And he was quite taken aback by that. And he said that he would come up right away and help me and take care of the kids while I recuperated. I laughed when he said that. The idea of him taking care of the kids and all that had to do with my recovery was truly laughable. Fine, suit yourself, he said, and hung up at one point. I honestly didn't even care. I was busy, and I was focused on being a mom, not being the psychopath whisperer. Mike wasn't sure what to do about my newfound sense of independence. He wanted to fix it, but he was having a very hard time convincing me that I needed him. He didn't have any money, so he couldn't shower me with gifts. He could only call and try to talk me into it over the phone, and it wasn't working. His frustration with me was obvious, and we had more than a few arguments about it. Whenever he would get angry, I would just hang up the phone and not answer it again for a few days. This was something he absolutely could not abide. I, however, was finding this rather entertaining, to be honest. One morning in September, he had called me as usual, and as we were talking, I happened to glance at the television. One of the World Trade Center towers had been struck by an airplane, and it was live on TV. I watched with horror as he continued rabbiting on about God knows what. I was watching it live as the second plane struck, and I gasped and dropped the phone. "What is your problem?" he asked, irritated. I explained that he should turn on the TV and look at what was happening in New York. He audibly rolled his eyes and went back to whatever it was he was talking about before that. He continued talking the entire time until I screamed when the first tower fell. "Oh my God, what is your problem today?" he barked. "Mike, one of the towers just collapsed. Oh my God, I hope they got everyone out. Oh my God." "I am trying to talk to you here," he yelled. I ignored him and turned up the TV so I could hear what they were saying. I screamed again and started crying pretty hard when the second tower collapsed. I didn't know anyone in the buildings, but I had been there before several times. We used to take trips to New York City often for shows, recitals, Broadway, all kinds of things. So although I didn't have a direct personal connection, it was still a familiar sight, and the thought of the people trapped in the buildings, well, that was utterly horrifying and tragic. Mike was furious at the latest scream and even more enraged now that I was crying on top of it. "What the hell is your problem? You don't know anyone in those towers. It's not like you live there or anything. God, can you not focus on me for one conversation?" I hung up the phone, completely disinterested in anything he could possibly have to say. I stayed glued to the television, as had most people in the world that day, and well into the next morning. He called back and asked if I was over my fit yet and if I was ready to talk to him. "No," I said and hung up. I was still watching the news as the tragedy unfolded, and the death toll kept climbing, including the Pentagon and the Pennsylvania crashes. I was feeling the same devastation as any normal human was. He called again later that afternoon and tried a different approach. "Hey," he said softly, "are you okay? I thought you might need to talk about it." Ah, there he was. Good Mike. Caring, gentle, empathetic Mike. I let down my guard and actually talked to him this time. He said all the right things and used the right tone of voice, very understanding, sympathetic to the loss of life and the fear that was gripping the country and the abject sorrow of an entire nation. He was just play acting, of course, but in that moment I forgot. I was lulled back in by the version of Mike that I really needed in that moment. It had taken him almost 2 whole days to figure out which version of himself was the right one, but he found it eventually. "Do you need me to come home?" he asked, and I said yes, weakly. "Okay, sweetheart, I'll leave in the morning." He said he loved me and hung up the phone. I almost didn't register what I had just done, as I was still glued to the scenes on the television of the rescue at Ground Zero in New York. All of the main TV stations were airing around-the-clock live coverage of the attack. They would replay the images over and over, show live shots of the wreckage of all 3 locations, and I could not stop watching it. Nor could anyone else, it seems, besides Mike. He called late the next day and said he was in New York, but the trains were all messed up and he couldn't get out of the city for a while, but he'd be here as soon as he could. I didn't care. I wasn't all that concerned with his arrival, and a delay was just fine with me. It gave me more time to watch the TV. It was a day, or perhaps even 2, later that he actually appeared. I hadn't gotten fussed about his impending arrival. I didn't spend hours picking out an outfit or doing my hair or makeup. I hadn't even made a fantastic meal or even stocked the pantry with his favorites. I didn't care. He was a grown man, and I'm sure he could handle getting his own Pepsi. I was actually surprised when he walked in. I forgot that he had a key, and I wondered why I didn't have the locks changed. Oh well. I stood up and turned my face away from the television and walked over to him. He dropped his bags and hugged me tightly. Ah, this part I had missed terribly. He held me for what seemed like an hour, and I wasn't in any rush to let go of him either, until Mac woke up and announced his presence. I laughed and I said, "You want to meet your little guy?" with a huge smile on my face. Mike walked up to the playpen and picked Mac up and cuddled him, talking to him softly and lovingly. My heart melted. This was the image I had had in the back of my mind way back when. Back that first day when I had met Mike in the limo on the way back from the airport. That day I had imagined this moment, and now it's finally happening. This was all I had ever wanted, and I was really happy. He asked where Maggie was, and I said that she was at school, but the bus would be here any minute. He came outside with me to the bus stop and hid around the side of a building to surprise her. I was holding Mac in my arms when Maggie climbed off the bus and ran to me for a hug. We took a few steps back toward the apartment when Mike burst out onto the sidewalk and scared her, but she laughed and jumped into his arms as soon as she realized who it was, and he picked her up and carried her all the way home. She seemed overjoyed. We got home, and he bought pizza for dinner. I appreciated that, as pizza was an expense that I didn't often splurge on. Everything felt good and normal. I got Maggie into the bath as he cuddled with Mac, and we both put the kids to bed and settled down on the couch together, just being in the moment. He had brought an air mattress with him so we could sleep together for a change, he said, and he got to work inflating the darned thing, which took forever. It had a foot press pump, not even an electric one. I laughed watching him as he was being overly dramatic and silly, pretending his leg was about to fall off and falling onto the floor and pumping the lever with his hand instead. He was just being funny and light-hearted, and I was happy. We went to sleep on our new air mattress, which was actually kind of comfortable, and I had the best sleep I had had in weeks. Within a week of him returning, Mike had gotten his old job back at McDonald's. Again. It wasn't much, but it was a lot more than we had without it. We had to have a long talk about money. His contention was that he should only have to give me half of his paychecks each week, and that should cover his share of the costs. I said that if that's what he wanted, and if that's what he believed, then I should be able to do the same thing too. I can keep half of my income for myself, and I showed him on paper that that wasn't even remotely feasible. Why should I have to pay for everything with a small contribution from him, and not be able to have half of my money for myself? But he should be able to do just that. He realized that he didn't really have a logical argument to support his view, and that we would try the joint funds plan of action. After doing the budget on paper with him right there, after all the bills were paid, and after all the necessities accounted for, that left about $25 a week for each of us to have to ourselves. Lean times, my friend, but lean times with all the bills paid is better than lean times without electricity or a telephone. He grudgingly agreed. We went over to the bank and set up a brand new account. I was very wary of him and banking after that check that he had forged. My income came in the form of a direct deposit, so I wasn't going to give him access to that account for anything. Our new account would be funded as money came in, and we'd pay the bills and buy groceries and other things from there. We agreed that neither of us was allowed to take money out unless it was discussed and agreed to ahead of time. Did I think that would work? Of course not, but at least it was stated. Mike had been on his good Mike best behavior since he had gotten back to Connecticut. Things were great, and Maggie and I felt comfortable and happy, and even little Mac was getting into the swing of things with his dad around. I did notice, though, around the third or fourth week that Mike had been back, that Maggie had wet the bed a few times. She was 7 now, so it wasn't simply toddler trouble. This concerned me greatly, and I talked to her about it, but she obviously didn't have an answer for it. I tried not to make a big deal with her, because I didn't want to add any extra stress to her world, assuming that that's what this was all about. We just changed the sheets on her bed together, and I'd reassure her that she was fine, and she wasn't in any trouble over it. It was just a thing that happened, and we'd be better about drinking less in the evenings and going potty right before bed. Mike, however, felt very differently about this. At this point, he was only voicing his concerns to me privately and not to Maggie, and I demanded that he leave her alone about it, and he was not even allowed to bring it up. The last thing she needed was him yelling at her about it. That would just make it worse. He agreed to my plan, but he didn't like it. We're going to take a short break right here, and when we come back, Mike starts slipping back into his bad Mike pattern. Let's see how I deal with it this time. Welcome back. As I said before the break, Mike had started slipping into his bad Mike moments. The thrill of being reunited was now gone, and the real him was showing through. He could never maintain his good Mike mask for very long. I imagine that took a tremendous amount of energy and focus to pull off. It started slowly with little comments here and there. He didn't like what I made for dinner, no matter what it was. The apartment was too small. When could we get something bigger? Why did he always have to carry the laundry up and down the stairs? Lots of little picky, fussy, stupid complaints, and I ignored them for the most part. He had come home from work one day with a cell phone. I confronted him about it immediately. How much are you paying for that, and what on earth do you need a cell phone for? He said he needed it for work. For work? McDonald's? Really? But it was cheap and prepaid, so there wasn't a bill, and I should mind my own business. He also informed me that it was his cell phone, and I wasn't allowed to touch it. Oh, really? We'll see about that, Buster, I thought to myself. He started getting text messages right away. He'd get them while we were watching TV or eating dinner, and he'd answer them immediately, always with a smile on his face. Who is that? I'd ask, and he'd say, oh, just work stuff. Work stuff, huh? I didn't think McDonald's had such a dynamic workforce, I said sarcastically, but he either didn't understand what I was really saying or just ignored me. Probably both. One morning, we woke to the alarm clock, and I got up to get Maggie ready for school. The bed was wet again, so I had to give her a quick bath and try to make it to the bus in time. I was in the bathroom with her when Mike discovered the wet bed. He burst into the bathroom and started yelling at Maggie. What the hell is wrong with you? You're not a damn barn animal. Use the bathroom like every other human on the planet. If this happens again, you'll be in serious trouble. Do you understand me? and I stared at him in shock for a moment, and Maggie burst into tears. "Oh, here we go with the tears again, and Mommy will make it all better. Make me the bad guy. Go ahead. You know you want to do it." I stood up, and I got right in Mike's face. "You have 5 seconds to get yourself out of here, starting now. 5, 4, 3. After I got to 3, he scoffed, turned around and left, slamming the door behind him, and, of course, waking Mac. Now I have 2 crying children and a school bus beeping outside. I didn't have time to feel an emotional reaction to this. I just had to get control of the situation and get Maggie dressed and off to school, reassured that she was okay and not to listen to anything that Mike had said. She recovered quickly and was off. Mac and I headed back inside for some breakfast and a quiet minute to think. In his rush to leave, Mike had forgotten his cell phone. I didn't even think about it until I heard it chime as a text message arrived. "Oh ho, what do we have here?" I didn't hesitate to grab it and see what this message was. I turned on the phone and the message simply said hi with a smiley face. Well, that's not much of anything, but who was this person? I had good reason to be very suspicious of Mike, given our history and the recent change in his demeanor. Everything else on the phone had been deleted, so there was nothing for me to read through, so I decided to check his emails. It took me only a minute to guess his password, and I logged into his account. There were a lot of emails there. There were a long series of emails to and from this one particular woman called Jessie Lou. Well, at least that's a better name than Vampirella, I thought to myself. I opened the most recent one and got quite a shock. He was planning on going to Massachusetts to see her for a weekend, very soon. Now, he had told me that he was going to be promoted at McDonald's, but in order to get his promotion, he had to go to this special burger college for managers for a weekend up in Massachusetts. Yeah, that suddenly made a whole lot more sense to me. I read through all of their messages to and from each other and realized that they had been carrying on together online since long before he had even come back to Connecticut. The things that he said about me to her were so hurtful, but very reminiscent of the things that he had said to me about Tina way back when. Also, the nice, sweet, loving things he said to her were just as hurtful to read, because he had used all of the same lines that he had with me, too. This is just a script that he's running, and the women playing the role of his paramour may change, but the story stays the same. Exactly the same. I did know something Jessie Lou did not know, however. She wasn't the only one. There were at least 2 other women that had been exchanging very flirtatious emails with him. Good grief. Now, Jessie Lou apparently was married with kids of her own, and although she complained bitterly about her husband, from what I could read, he seemed to be a very involved and a very loving father. He was about to get a shock. Geez. I sat and I thought about all of this for a moment. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I just felt like, well, it was good while it lasted, but I was done. I got Mac settled for his nap and started packing up all of Mike's things. I put all of his bags out in the hallway. I called the landlord and asked for the lock to be changed as soon as possible and gave a brief explanation of why, and the landlord's son, Brian, came over and changed the lock within the hour. He asked about all the stuff that was piled in the hallway, and I told him it was Mike's and hopefully he'd be picking it up soon. I called the McDonald's and asked to speak to Mike, but I was told that he wasn't scheduled to work that day. Oh, really? Interesting. If he shows up, tell him he better get home quick because all of his belongings are outside and they can get stolen if he doesn't get them fast. Whoever it was that I had spoken to somehow must have managed to get a message to Mike because he showed up within 10 minutes of that call. When he banged on the door after trying to open it, I went into the hallway and locked the door behind me. I wasn't going to let him in there to rage and upset or wake Mac again. "What the hell is this?" he asked. And I said, "Well, I just wanted to help you get to Jessie Lou's place faster, so I packed for you. I hope you guys have a long, happy life together. But just so you know, I talked to Bob, and he's really excited to meet you." Now that stopped Mike dead in his tracks. He spun around and looked at me, completely surprised by this. "You talked to Bob?" Yeah, I said. You know Bob, Jesse's husband. He is such a nice guy. He adores his wife and his kids. He was a little surprised to hear about your visit. I guess you forgot to tell him, but he said he can't wait to meet you. So have a good time. I wish you the best of luck. I went back inside and closed and locked the door before he could respond. He tried to open the door, even tried his key, and pounded on the door when he discovered that it no longer worked. Brian had still been in the building, doing some random maintenance stuff, and when he heard the banging, he came down the stairs and asked Mike if everything was all right. I was eavesdropping through the door, of course, and Mike stammered a little, yeah, fine, my key just won't work, oh well. And Brian said, yeah, I changed the locks. I think you need to just go, bud. And he stood there as Mike collected his bags and headed out of the building. Brian knocked on my door, and I opened it right away. Hey, thanks, I told him. No problem. If he comes back, just call the police. Don't hesitate, okay? I nodded and thanked him again. Brian was a good guy. Now let me go back in the story a bit, because I had skipped the part where I talked to Bob, because I didn't want to spoil that surprise bomb that I dropped on Mike's head. Little Miss Jessie Lou had put her full name and address in an email to Mike. Clearly he needed that info since he was going to go see her. But her phone number was in there too, so I called it. A man answered, and I said that I was looking for Jessie. He said, well, she wasn't home, so I asked him, are you Bob, her husband? And then he was intrigued. Well, yeah, who's this? He inquired. And I told him everything. He asked me to forward the emails, which I did, and he read them while I was on the phone with him. He was shocked, and he wanted to be in denial, but he couldn't, having read their story right there in black and white. She had told him that she was going to spend that weekend with her sister, which she had never done before, and he thought that was strange, and that suddenly made sense to him. And he started to cry. Bob and I talked for about 2 hours, bonding over our mutual betrayal and sadness. He said he didn't know what he was going to do about it, but he needed some time to think. I explained that I had kicked Mike out, and he could very well be on his way up there right now, so he should keep an eye out and be careful. He said he would, and told me to do the same, and asked if he could have my email address and all so we could keep in touch. Of course, I said, and we exchanged contact information. I felt really bad for Bob. He had been married to her for almost 10 years, and they had 3 kids, and he was, until this very moment, extremely happily married. He was blindsided. He had no idea this was coming. I, on the other hand, expected something like this, and eventually, and I wasn't the least bit surprised by it. I was hurt, sure, but not surprised. I was feeling a cold anger, a bitter detachment, and a rather frightening and calculated desire to completely destroy every single aspect of Mike's entire world. I was on a mission now, and I wouldn't rest until I was sure he was utterly lost and alone and miserable. What was that I said all those episodes ago about mutually assured destruction? Here we go. This was a new side of me that I hadn't really experienced fully before. Sure, I had been mad at people for all kinds of reasons, but this wasn't anger. This was something else. I was perfectly calm, but I could feel my eyes now permanently narrowed, and there was a very satisfying feeling coursing through me. I had become Karma, destroyer of worlds. And oh, this would be fun. The very first thing I did, though, was walk across the street to the bank and close that account out, which they wouldn't let me do since he was a signer on it, but I was able to withdraw all the funds and transfer them to my own bank account. That was safe now, and he hadn't thought to get that money before I did. Awen 1, Mike 0. And this was just the beginning. So tune into the next episode to see if I manage to extract my pound of flesh or if I let Mike off the hook. Until then, thanks for listening and take care.
People ask me what my secret